This is the first update on the final month of the Retro Remakes challenge. Eric and the Floaters, a Bomberman style game from 1982. I won't be posting as regularly as I otherwise would this month, very busy, but I'll try and post longer videos with more updates. This is the first such video with 4 parts. To begin with, we'll look at just how I kick-started the project and got the basics up and running, pulling in some of the graphics from the original game, pulling them into an art package, GIMP in this case, and scaling them up. So in my tile map, each smaller square is 32 by 32, which would be the equivalent of the 8 by 8 on the original Spectrum. So the larger blocks you can see there, the big squares that you see used in the map, are 64 by 64, which is the equivalent of 16 by 16. It gives a little bit more flexibility, I think, in the original game when they were moving the larger characters around. I've also pulled the character in, very simple sprite, and as you can see it moves smoothly but stops on half block or 32 by 32 increments, which is exactly the same as was implemented in the original game. The movement's really simple because it moves but only within blocks. There's no need for any collision detection or physics, no kinematic bodies. It just moves around and checks to see what tiles are under before moving. Okay, on to the second part of the work. A couple of days later, I started looking at the explosion effect and how that might work. In the original, the explosion is made up of 8 by 8 blocks, which allows the engine to draw only parts that can be seen if the bomb isn't placed on an exact 8 by 8, 16 by 16 block, if you like, so somewhere between 2 blocks. I didn't want to do that because I felt I could get much nicer explosion effects in 64 by 64 than I could in 32 by 32 with those constraints. So I started looking at ways of masking the 64 by 64 depending on which subparts were visible. Godot has a nice way of doing that using 2D light masks with a bitmap. Unfortunately, it has some constraints in that you can only have a single image. If you have more than one image used in the light mask, it goes wrong. So I started looking at ways around that, and I came up with this way of rendering a separate world into a new viewport and then into a texture which I could use as the light map. So here you can see I've got a simple world with 4 quadrants of a simple white square, which scaled correctly is 64 by 64, and then I can draw that, or I can use that texture in the mask to mask off parts of a block. So if the bomb was placed like this, for example, only these 2 squares, or these column of squares of tiles would be seen. The other ones to the right would not. So I can use the mask bits to turn off parts of the explosion effect, only showing the bits that would actually be subject to the explosion. It gives a lot more control. It was quite neat way of doing it, I think. It does mean that I have complete programmatic control over which quadrants are visible just by turning any one of those 4 things on and off and using that map in the mask, that texture map in the mask. So this red sprite here is just a placeholder to check that it was working. So you can see as I switch on and off the quadrants, you can see you get the masking effect, and it works for particles as well. Anything on that layer will be masked by the same texture, so I can control completely which parts of the particle explosion are seen and which are not. It worked quite well. So if I quickly show you this in action, if I bring this into this I'll call this the old explosion, I'll explain why in a moment, into the bomb, and just enable some code which turns those quadrants on and off depending on which parts of the map can see the explosion, which I've pre-calculated elsewhere. And if you run this, you can see this column in the middle there is only half visible. The mask turns off the right hand side of that because it's placed where the wall is, so it wouldn't make any sense to draw that. So it works really well. Unfortunately, once I'd got it working and tried it out a few times, I wasn't happy with the way that the explosion is constrained within the square blocks. It just looks wrong. So back to the drawing board a little bit, and in the end I tried something dramatic, which is just turning the whole lot off and just let the particle system work completely freely within the engine. But what I did is I placed the explosion effectively in the layer between the tile map and the black background, so the brick wall will draw over the explosion, effectively masking it out, but allowing the explosion to be less constrained, which I think looks much nicer. It has some issues, it's not exactly perfect, but it looks nicer, I think, just not looking more like an explosion and less like an explosion in a glass box, which bothered me a little bit. So I think with the explosions working as they are now, I'm quite happy with that, and I'll move on to the next part. In part 3, I've decided to start looking at the gameplay, trying to get a few gameplay elements in just to make sure all that's possible. I've added a GUI with some controls for scoring and so on, and a floater. And the floater is really simple, again graphics borrowed from the original. It can be in one of two modes, random movement or chasing. If it's in chasing mode, and it'll randomly swap between the two. If it's in chasing mode, it will change to red. If it's in random movement, it will be in magenta. When in random movement mode, it starts a random timer between 2 and 5 seconds, and when that triggers, it will optionally change direction, so it's just moving around randomly, changing direction at will. When it's in chase mode, it'll find Eric and try and get closer, looking in horizontal and vertical direction to see which way it can move and which one's furthest, and try and get closer to Eric as it possibly can. So you can see there we've got a couple of magenta floating ones which are just randomly moving around, and then occasionally they'll change to red, which means they'll actively try to get closer to Eric. The explosion most of the time catches the floaters, not always, as you saw at the start. Sometimes it'll miss. On to the fourth part, I decided to look at the graphics a little just to have some fun. Back in GIMP I added some more brick-like textures and some cracking for the fragile bricks that can be exploded. I'll probably come back to that again and do some more, but it's adequate for now. The other thing I noticed is that the explosions you could walk through, and the floaters could go through the explosions, which is not good. And I mentioned before that I use just very simple collision detection or collision avoidance. I didn't want to bring physics into play, so I decided the best way to do it is to add this simple white tile but make it transparent. As you can see over to the right, that each tile can have its modulate change, so I've changed that to fully transparent. And in the explosion I place a number of those, depending on the nature of the explosion, onto the grid. And just the fact that there is a tile there will be enough to prevent Eric and the floaters from being able to enter those grid squares, because the code logic just looks for an empty space and will allow you to move if there is one and not if there isn't. So that was sufficient, and when the explosion is complete and fades out, it just removes those blockers, so allowing movement again. So that was a very simple fix for that problem. So now what we have, as of about 10-11 hours worth of effort, you can see that balloon there couldn't go through the explosion, and neither could Eric. A game that kind of works. It doesn't, as you can see there, doesn't kill, the explosions don't kill Eric at the moment, but that's fairly simple to do. But the scoring works, the bonus countdown works, and you can basically play it.